Have you ever heard of a trial where no one could predict the outcome? A trial that not only exposed the guilt of one person, but also brought down an entire system on a freezing morning in Washington. Congresswoman Amelia Grant, a rising political star, stepped into the courtroom with no lawyer, no security, and nothing but an old leather briefcase. Everyone thought she would crumble under the crushing weight of treason charges. But they were wrong, because what lay inside that briefcase wasn't just paperwork. It was the truth, a truth buried for years, ready to shatter all the lies. Get ready, because this isn't just a hearing. It's the final battle between power and memory, where one woman's voice could shake an entire nation to its core. In less than 10 minutes, Commissioner Raynard Whitmore, head of the Federal High Security Commission, FHSC, an agency rivaling the power of both the NSA and the National Security Council, brought the nation to a standstill when he accused Congresswoman Amelia Grant of treason. The hearing was broadcast live. Over 22 million Americans were watching as the room overflowed with press, political aides, and legal analysts. Yet no one was prepared for what happened next. Amelia didn't protest. She didn't shout. She didn't ask for counsel. Instead, she quietly opened her worn leather briefcase and pulled out something thin, aged, and fragile, a letter, not from a lawyer, but from a grieving black mother whose only son died in a classified military operation the government tried to erase. The entire hearing room froze. A few advisors in the back wiped away tears. A stenographer's fingers hovered midair. Even Commissioner Whitmore's hands began to tremble slightly. Something had shifted. Something powerful. A truth, so profound and unshakable, had surfaced, one that threatened to unravel months of carefully constructed allegations. This was no longer a hearing. This was an indictment not of a woman, but of an entire system. And for the first time in Commissioner Whitmore's ironclad career, silence was broken not by authority, but by memory. But to understand the force of that letter, you'd have to return to that morning, to the moment Amelia Grant walked alone into the lion's den. It was a bitter Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., the kind that coated windshields in ice and made even seasoned staffers check the forecast twice. The sky hung heavy, low, and gray, not just with snow, but with something unspoken, an omen, maybe. Inside the FHSC headquarters, tension coiled in the air like static before a lightning strike. Reporters from CNN, NPR, Fox, and ABC clustered in anxious groups, gripping audio recorders and foam coffee cups like lifelines. Rumors had been swirling for days: sealed indictments, an emergency hearing, a possible breach of national security. Word was, a sitting member of Congress would be questioned regarding intelligence leaks tied to Operation Echo Harvest, a Black Ops mission buried so deep that even the Senate Intelligence Committee had been left in the dark. But no one expected her. Not Amelia Grant. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a star. A civil rights attorney who'd won 4 major federal cases. A rising force in the reformist Republican Party. A former nominee on the top 100 young leaders shaping America. And now, she wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to expose the truth. At exactly 8:58 a.m., the heavy double doors at the front of the commission's primary hearing chamber creaked open. Every head turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the camera crews, usually restless and whispered, stilled their hands. And then she walked in, Congresswoman Amelia Grant, alone. No security detail, no legal counsel, no entourage of aides whispering instructions into her ear. Just her. Her figure was tall and composed, wrapped in a navy blue tailored suit, one that didn't scream for attention, but radiated quiet authority. Her heels tapped methodically across the marble floor, each step echoing like a metronome counting down to something no one could predict. Click, click, click. She carried only a weathered leather briefcase in one hand, the kind that didn't just hold papers, but held purpose. Her hair was pulled back tightly, not for vanity, for control. She didn't glance at the senators packed into the rear rows. She didn't acknowledge the flash of cameras or the murmurs that surged through the press gallery. She didn't look at Whitmore sitting on the elevated dais. She looked forward. Only forward. In her stride was a strange, unnerving calm, the kind that belongs to someone who had nothing left to lose. Or perhaps, someone who came not to survive, but to strike. That's her alone. No lawyer. She's not even trying to fight this. Whispers darted through the room like wasps. A few snickers. A few looks of smug satisfaction. Some people were waiting for her fall with barely concealed glee. To them, she was walking toward the scaffold, but Amelia didn't flinch. She reached the defendant's table, placed her briefcase beside her chair, and sat, smoothly, calmly. She opened the latches with care, peeked inside for a moment, then closed it again like someone laying a trap. She folded her hands on the table and waited. At 9:01, the door at the front opened once more. Commissioner Reynard Whitmore entered, draped in a dark charcoal robe, not the kind worn by traditional judges, but tailored like a general's cloak. His presence was heavy. His jaw was set. He walked with the cadence of a man who understood he wasn't about to deliver justice, he was about to write history. There were no opening statements, no call to order. He didn't wait for silence. His voice, when it came, was clear and deep. A voice trained not in empathy, but in execution. Congresswoman Amelia Grant. He began without preamble. This commission is in possession of declassified intelligence, indicating that you knowingly withheld critical data regarding Operation Echo Harvest. You are hereby accused of treason against the United States of America. You will answer under oath. The air was sucked from the room. A woman in the back dropped her pen. A man in the press gallery muttered, "Holy hell," a little too loud. One of the younger staffers at the rear actually smiled and fist-bumped under the table, thinking this was the beginning of the end for Amelia. The accusation, delivered on live national broadcast, was brutal, efficient, and surgical. Exactly how Whitmore liked his victories. But at the eye of the storm, Amelia stood slowly. Her chair scraped softly behind her. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She didn't quote constitutional law. She simply placed both hands flat on the table, looked up at Commissioner Whitmore, and asked, "Are you sure you want this?" The words didn't boom. They didn't need to. They hit harder than any denial, any counter-argument, not arrogance, not fear, just conviction. Whitmore blinked. His jaw twitched. His fingers tightened on the edge of his lectern, a minor tremor, but enough for the room to catch it. In that moment, a few people began to realize Amelia Grant hadn't walked into a trial. She had walked into war. And whatever she had brought in that battered briefcase, it wasn't just evidence. It was going to change everything. No one in the chamber moved. For a moment, it seemed the entire world had gone still, the cameras, the audience, even Commissioner Whitmore. The silence wasn't stunned. It was anticipatory, like the air itself was waiting to see what Amelia would do. And then, quietly, she reached for her briefcase. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just two practiced clicks of the latches. She opened it not like a defendant preparing a rebuttal, but like someone opening a box of memories, personal, painful, powerful. She didn't pull out legal papers. She didn't present exhibits or affidavits. She withdrew a single folded letter, old, crumpled, its edges browned with time. One corner was taped, another smudged, possibly from tears, dirt, or both. There was a faint coffee stain at the bottom and a torn crease down the center, mended carefully. She held it with both hands like it mattered more than any law book ever could. "This," she said softly, her voice even but unwavering, "is not evidence. It's truth. The kind we were never meant to see." And just like that, the entire chamber transformed. No longer a battlefield of politics and power, but a sacred space, where the voices long silenced were about to speak. Amelia unfolded the letter with careful reverence, as though afraid the paper might disintegrate in her hands. The room was so quiet that the soft rustling of parchment was audible to those in the back rows. Then she began to read. "My name is Celeste Monroe. I am the mother of Private First Class Elijah Monroe. He was my only child. He died 2 years ago in a military operation the Army never explained." Her voice was calm, steady, but underneath it was a second rhythm, something visceral, something real. It wasn't just reading, it was remembering. "They came to my door with a flag and 3 men in uniform. They called him a hero. They said he served with honor. But they never told me how he died. They never told me why." There was movement in the gallery, subtle, involuntary. A journalist lowered her phone. One senator leaned forward, still as stone. Amelia read on, her voice sharpening as the words carved deeper. "I asked questions. They said it was classified. I begged. They said it was national security. But the night I closed his bedroom door for the last time, I knew they were hiding something." A ripple of discomfort passed through the rows like a cold draft. Amelia continued. "For months, I couldn't sleep. I started hearing his footsteps. I smelled his shampoo in the hallway. Sometimes, I thought I heard him laugh. Then I'd remember he wasn't coming home. That sentence shattered something. You could feel it." A sniffle came from somewhere in the audience. Subtle at first, then another. Even from those who had come waiting to watch a downfall, they weren't ready for this. This wasn't about Amelia anymore. It wasn't about the commission or politics. It was about a mother. "I'm not writing this to punish anyone. I just want someone, anyone, to tell the truth. I want someone to say my son mattered. That he wasn't just a name buried in redacted files." Amelia paused, not to dramatize, but to let the silence return and fill the room like a tide. When she looked up, she wasn't speaking to the commission anymore. She was speaking to America. And America, from the senators in the back row to the viewers at home, was listening. The arrogance had left the room. The scoffing smiles were gone. The courtroom, once tense with strategy and spectacle, had become a memorial. A few jurors stared ahead, lips parted. One, a former Navy SEAL, pressed his knuckles against his mouth. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keyboard, motionless. She couldn't type. Not yet. This wasn't just testimony. It was grief, and it was sacred. And Amelia Grant had done what no legal defense could. She had made them feel. The silence in the room hadn't lifted. It lingered not awkwardly, but heavily, like a fog after a battlefield has gone quiet. But Amelia Grant wasn't finished. Not even close. She set the letter down gently, folding it as if she were tucking someone in. Her hand, steady moments ago, now trembled slightly. But she didn't pause for effect. She reached again into her briefcase. This time, what she pulled out was not fragile, not personal. It was cold, printed, official. She laid a stack of declassified government documents onto the table, thick, stamped, marked top secret, Operation Echo Harvest. The seal had been crossed out in red, but the weight of what they once meant still radiated from the paper. Cameras zoomed in. Legal observers leaned forward. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. "I'm entering these into the public record," Amelia said. "They were declassified 7 days ago. They are not rumors. They are not theories. They are federal records stamped, signed, and real." Some scoffed. A man in the media pit chuckled, shaking his head. "She thinks she's in a damn movie," someone whispered, but Amelia ignored them. She picked up the top page. The heading screamed in thick black font, Operation Echo Harvest. Strategic Field Report, Bravo Sector, Phase 2. Beneath it, coordinates, names, protocols, and lines, so many lines that once had been blacked out, now fully visible. She flipped to the next page. "This report," she said evenly, "was filed 48 hours after Private Elijah Monroe was declared deceased. Here." She pointed to a single line and read it aloud. "Subject showed signs of life during extraction. Breathing shallow. Field medic alerted. No follow-up recorded." The words fell like stones in a still lake. The gallery gasped. The judge's assistant blinked, stunned. Amelia let the silence stretch. The implication was already bleeding into the room. Elijah Monroe had been alive. He wasn't killed instantly. He wasn't beyond saving. He was left behind. Not by accident. Not by confusion. By design. Someone had decided to treat a human life like a checkbox. And unchecked it. This wasn't war. It was negligence, possibly even murder, buried under the guise of classified operations. Amelia pulled out another document. The seal of Stratcor Defense. A private military contractor was faint, but unmistakable. This was the company assigned to Bravo Sector Logistics. She placed it beside the others. The report detailed gear allocations, including 2 missing defibrillators and an unlogged field med kit. And then came the moment that would send a ripple through the country. Amelia reached once more into her case, not slowly this time, and pulled out a photograph. Grainy, gray, but clear enough. 2 men seated at a restaurant in Georgetown. One in judicial black, the other in a dark suit, raising a glass of wine. Raynard Whitmore, Leonard Sutter, Commissioner of the FHSC and the CEO of Stratcor Defense. "This was taken 8 months ago," Amelia said, "at a private dinner between the man presiding over this trial and the man whose company ran the operation that left Elijah Monroe to die." Gasps erupted, not symbolic ones, real, physical, guttural. A woman in the press row dropped her pen. A juror covered her mouth. A military vet in the back muttered, "Jesus." Whitmore shifted in his chair. His stoic mask cracked only slightly. But enough. Amelia didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She let the picture speak, and it screamed. The room remained frozen after the photo hit the table. But the confrontation wasn't over. There was a sound, faint, then growing louder. The rear courtroom door creaked open, without fanfare or announcement. No bailiff, no escort, just the soft, rhythmic click, click, click of a cane on hardwood. All heads turned. A small, elderly woman, barely 5 feet tall, gray curls pinned tightly, entered with quiet purpose. She wore a modest brown cardigan, and though she leaned on her cane, her steps were steady, not hesitant like someone who had walked through grief and come out hardened. not broken. Evelyn Monroe, Elijah's grandmother, the woman who had written the letter. Amelia saw her, and for the first time that morning, her composure wavered. Silently, she stepped aside, offering space without a word. Evelyn didn't ask permission. She approached the witness stand, adjusted the microphone with care, and fixed her gaze directly on Commissioner Whitmore. "I buried my daughter," she began, her voice low but unshaking. "Then I buried my grandson, and all I've ever wanted is to know what happened, not what was in the letter, not what they printed in the papers. The truth." She reached into her purse and pulled out an old, worn photograph, Elijah in uniform, smiling beside an old beat-up car. A sticker on the bumper read, "Proud Army Mom." "He loved that car," she said softly, her hand trembling. "Said he was going to fix it up when he got home, but he never came home. And they never told us why." Her voice cracked not from weakness, but from bearing 2 funerals and 1,000 unanswered questions. The room was still, but now it wasn't the stillness of intimidation. It was the stillness of guilt. She stepped back, slowly, and sat down. And then, another woman stood, short auburn hair, tired eyes, a face that wore the exhaustion of sleepless years. "My name is Susan Hale," she said. "I was the Army nurse on duty that night." A ripple passed through the gallery. Her credentials were beyond dispute, decorated, honored, respected. But her eyes told another story. She sat slowly, holding a small folder in her lap, but she didn't open it. Her voice was no louder than a whisper. "That night, we were told everything was classified. No questions, no notes, no deviation. We were told to stay silent." She paused, her hands trembling as she folded them tightly. "But I saw Elijah." Her voice cracked not with shame, but from the weight of memory. He was still breathing, very faint, but alive. He looked right at me, and he kept saying, she choked, "Tell my mama I'm okay." Over and over again. Like if he said it enough, it might come true. Each repetition was like a blade, and the courtroom began to buckle under the weight. No one dared speak. No one even breathed loudly. In that moment, it was like Elijah Monroe himself was in the room. Susan looked down at her hands and murmured one final line, barely audible, but searing, but no one answered him. And he died alone. A journalist lowered her camera and covered her mouth with her hand. A juror clenched the armrest so hard that his knuckles turned white. This wasn't testimony. This was confession. And Susan Hale, who had stayed silent for 2 long years, now stood in front of the nation and gave the truth a voice. The room was already trembling under the weight of truth, but Amelia Grant had one final blow to deliver. She nodded to a technician seated off to the side of the chamber. He paused, waiting for a signal. Amelia gave the smallest motion a tilt of the chin, and the room dimmed slightly. Then came a soft crackle from the courtroom's speaker system. Static, then clarity. A voice played. Cold, calm, calculated. It was Reynard Whitmore. If the mother pushes too hard, if she leaks anything about a protocol breach, we'll shut the story down before it spreads. The recording was only 12 seconds long, but it landed like a detonation. Gasps erupted across the room. One senator dropped her notepad. A military aide closed his eyes and mouthed the words, "Oh my God." The court reporter actually flinched, her fingers curling away from the keyboard. There was no mistaking the voice. Not misquoted, not out of context. It was Whitmore himself, not simply complicit in the cover-up, but strategizing it, not reacting, engineering. The man presiding over the hearing had, at some point, spoken the words that would forever unmake his credibility. And suddenly, all the pomp and power of the commission evaporated. No gavel strike could undo what had just been heard. Reynard Whitmore shifted slowly in his seat, like a man who knew the ground beneath him had crumbled. His jaw tensed. He looked not at Amelia, nor at the jury, but at the floor. Because the game was over. There would be no rebuttal, no spin, no context. And Amelia Grant. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even speak. Because she didn't need to. The letter had broken their hearts. The documents had opened their eyes. The photograph had revealed their hypocrisy. The nurse's voice had pierced their conscience. And the recording? It left them with no more illusions. What had started as an effort to humiliate a congresswoman had become an exposed wound, laid bare in front of a nation. Even the most cynical journalist in the room had put down their pen. Even the coldest military official had stopped blinking. Amelia stood silently, letting the moment sit. Then, slowly, she turned not toward the judge, not toward the gallery, but toward a small wooden object leaning quietly against the wall behind her. And with deliberate grace, she walked over and picked it up. A chair. Not a courtroom chair, not a government-issued seat. Just a simple, worn kitchen chair, the kind you'd find tucked beneath an old table in a family dining room. She carried it to the front and placed it beside the witness box, then rested one hand on its backrest. This, she said softly, belonged to Elijah. She paused. His grandmother gave it to me the day she buried her daughter. She told me, this is where he sat every night for dinner. This is where he told us he was going to enlist. This is the last place he laughed before he left. Amelia's fingers brushed the edge of the worn wood. It's just a chair. Just wood. But it's been empty for 2 years, and it's a reminder of what silence costs. She didn't add another word. She didn't need to. The documents had proven the case, but the chair told the truth. The chamber remained suspended in a heavy stillness after Amelia placed the wooden chair beside the witness stand. Each person in the room saw that chair differently. Some saw loss, others saw guilt, and perhaps a few those with medals on their jackets saw themselves. Because there was no denying it anymore. This wasn't courtroom evidence. It was a wound placed in plain sight before an entire nation. Then, from the very back of the gallery, came a sound no one expected. Tiny footsteps. Every head turned. A young boy, no more than 9, wearing a blazer that hung too big on his frame, walked slowly down the aisle. He wasn't afraid. He didn't look left or right. He looked straight at Amelia. Clutched in both of his small hands was something small and precious. Amelia knelt down, lowering herself to his eye level. The boy hesitated, then opened his palms. In them lay a worn military medal, its edges chipped, its ribbon faded and frayed. The medal had been held too often, too tightly for far too long. His voice was no more than a whisper, but it rang through the silence. My big brother's name was James. He died 2 years ago. Nobody ever told us why. He looked down at the medal, then back at Amelia and added, but you told the truth. And Amelia Grant, who had stood tall through accusations, deception, power plays, and political sabotage, finally broke. Not for the cameras, not for drama, But because a child had just handed her back the one thing the system had tried so hard to bury, trust, she reached out with both hands, accepting the metal like it was glass, something fragile and sacred. She didn't wipe her tears. She didn't apologize. She let them fall freely, openly in front of the judge, the cameras, the country. Because in that moment, it wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about performance. It was about a little boy, a brother lost, and a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The courtroom, once a fortress of authority and control, had become something reverent. Not because of what Amelia said, but because of what she had made them all feel, and because that empty chair and that tiny medal left something behind in each of them, a sense of someone lost, and a realization that this time they couldn't look away. Amelia Grant did not speak again. She did not deliver a fiery closing statement. She didn't point fingers. She didn't call for justice with fanfare. She simply turned, medal in hand, and walked quietly toward the courtroom doors. But when she opened them, she didn't step into a hallway. She stepped into a crowd. Thousands of people were packed shoulder to shoulder on the courthouse steps. No chants, no shouting, just silence. They weren't there to protest. They were there to witness. Some had driven in from neighboring states. Others had come from across the city. Veterans stood with medals on their coats and hands clasped in front of them. Mothers held framed photos of sons and daughters in uniform. Children sat on shoulders holding handmade signs that read, "Tell the truth. His life mattered. We're still waiting." No one reached out to touch Amelia. They parted for her not like a politician, but like someone walking a sacred path. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't about scandal anymore. It was about memory. And memory, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. Hours later, as news outlets scrambled to interpret what had just happened, a short notice appeared from the clerk's office of the Federal High Security Commission. No press conference, no public address, no final speech, just a quiet filing, buried under administrative updates. Raynard Whitmore had resigned. No explanation, no defense, just the sound of a heavy door closing behind a man who no longer had the right to speak. And the nation trembled. The news rippled through government offices, media channels, and living rooms like an aftershock. Allies went silent. Critics didn't know whether to cheer or mourn. But for those who had been inside courtroom 4C that day, for the ones who had felt it in their chest, the message was clear. This wasn't just a resignation. It was a surrender, not to a person, not to a party, but to truth. The kind of truth that doesn't yell, that doesn't debate, that just waits. And once heard, changes everything. 3 days later, there was no ceremony, no honor guard, no military flyover, only a black granite wall that quietly appeared in a secluded corner of Arlington National Cemetery. No cameras, no podium, no press, just the wind, and names carved silently into stone. No ranks, no titles, no alphabetical order. But if you looked closely, you'd see what made this wall different. These were the names buried in redacted files, the erased, the forgotten, the ones who died but were never acknowledged. At the base of the wall, flowers began to appear. No one knew who placed the first. Then came notes handwritten slipped into plastic sleeves or pinned down with small stones. Fragments of remembrance. One read, "You were never invisible to us." Another, "Your name lives now." A third, in faded ink, "I'm sorry it took this long, just after sunrise, before the sun could fully warm the granite, Amelia Grant arrived. She brought no escort, no speech, only a hand quiet, steady resting on the name Elijah Monroe. She didn't stay long, not because there was nothing left to say, but because his name had already said enough. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't heavy. It was clean, true, like sky after a storm. There were no more flashbulbs, no more outrage, just a wall, a name, and a memory finally returned. A few days later, Amelia Grant sat barefoot on the porch of her small home in Virginia. The wood was warm beneath her feet, the sky clear. The chaos had passed. Not entirely, but enough to let the world breathe again. Beside her sat her 6-year-old niece, Avery, swinging her legs as she balanced a plastic mixing bowl in her lap. The kind of bowl too big for her hands, but just right for cookie dough. Avery was quiet. She had watched the news, heard the whispers, felt the heaviness in her aunt's eyes. Then, suddenly, she looked up. "Auntie Amelia, can we bake cookies?" Amelia smiled gently. "Cookies?" Avery nodded, eyes wide. "Cookies for the soldiers in heaven. You said some of them didn't have anyone, so maybe we could send them cookies, just so they know we remember?" Amelia blinked, caught off guard. Her throat tightened. She leaned down and wrapped her arm around the little girl's shoulders. "Yes, baby, every single one." And they did. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with the scent of sugar, butter, and something too tender to name, Amelia stepped outside to find a letter taped to her front door. It was handwritten. No envelope. Just a name scrawled across the corner. Evelyn Monroe. Amelia peeled the paper from the wood with care. She unfolded it slowly, as if it might fall apart in her hands. "You brought my grandson home," it read, "not with a casket, but with truth. That's more than the government ever gave me. Thank you, Evelyn." There were no other words. None were needed. Amelia pressed the letter to her chest and sat down on the porch steps. The breeze moved through the trees like a sigh. Inside, Avery called out, "Auntie, the cookies are burning." Amelia laughed, really laughed through the tears that came anyway. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and whispered to herself, "It doesn't fix everything, but maybe it's enough for now." People often believe that justice wears a black robe, that it resides in marble courthouses with majestic pillars, that it is handed down through verdicts, pounded out by wooden gavels, and measured in years printed on sentencing documents. But sometimes, justice wears no robe. Sometimes, it wears grief. Sometimes, it walks in with a cane and a faded photo. Sometimes, it is an exhausted nurse whispering a name no one dares to speak. And sometimes, it's just a weathered wooden chair, empty, scratched, and silent, waiting for someone brave enough to say, "He was here. He lived. And we will not forget." Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's simply truth spoken aloud, and truth raw and inconvenient isn't buried because it's weak. It's buried because it disrupts, because it shakes the foundation, because it makes the powerful uncomfortable. But when someone dares to break the silence, truth no longer threatens, it heals. Amelia Grant didn't fight with rage. She didn't throw files, pound tables, or shout. She fought with compassion, with memory, and with a voice strong enough to carry the forgotten. And in doing so, she reminded us of something essential. Justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in the heart. It begins when we choose to care, when we ask the hard questions, when we listen to voices long ignored, and when we honor lives not with headlines, but with humanity. Because if we choose truth, even when it's hard to hear, if we choose empathy, even when it costs us something, then we don't just become better citizens, we become better people. Late afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the porch like a soft blanket draped over everything. In the small kitchen, the scent of baked cookies still lingered in the air, and the sound of a child's laughter drifted in from another room as if nothing in the world had ever been broken. Amelia Grant sat alone on the steps, her eyes half closed, a cup of tea in her hands. There were no cameras, no accusations, no staring eyes, only her and a quiet peace. A breeze moved gently through her hair. She wasn't thinking of victory. She wasn't thinking of the fall of a commissioner. She wasn't thinking about the files that had finally been unsealed. She was thinking of a vacant chair, a medal held too many times, a fragile voice in the dark saying, "Tell my mama, I'm okay." She thought of those who would never return, and those who had spoken up when no one else would. There was no statue raised for Amelia Grant, no street named after her, no textbook chapter written in her honor. But she knew, and America in its quietest places knew too. A wound had been uncovered. A wall had been built. A name had been carved into stone. And a child had been taught that the truth was worth defending. That night, as the lights dimmed in the house, Amelia pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket, Evelyn's letter. She read it one last time, then folded it carefully, not to store it away, but to keep it as a reminder. That justice isn't an ending. It's a journey of memory and mercy. And when we walk that path, not for ourselves, but for others, even silence can become the most powerful voice of all. The story of Elijah Monroe has come to an end, but the questions it raises still linger in everyone who witnessed it. Not just questions about one man's guilt, not just about a commissioner's abuse of power, not just about a buried military operation, but questions meant for all of us. We have heard the cries of those who were silenced, but have we truly listened? We have seen a system bent out of shape, but will we stand straight in its place? We watched a woman speak truth to power, but are we brave enough to do the same? Even in the smallest corners of our own lives, Amelia Grant wasn't born to be a hero. She wasn't extraordinary. She was shaped by grief, by patience, and by one quiet decision: to stop staying silent. Because silence, as we've seen, isn't just inaction, it's a cut. It's what keeps truth locked away in the dark. But if there can be one person brave enough to break it, there can be two, then 10, then thousands, then a nation that learns to feel before it judges, because justice cannot exist if it only serves the visible. Justice must also illuminate the forgotten. Elijah Monroe was once buried in redacted files. Now, he lives in the memory of a country that is slowly learning how to remember. If you've stayed with this story until the very last line, then perhaps it touched something in you. Not because of the revelations, not because of the photos or the recordings, but because of something deeply human. A vacant chair, a medal worn smooth from grief, a little boy standing tall before a silent crowd, a grandmother holding a photo of the grandson she buried, a truth once buried now called by its real name. And if your heart tightened even a little, if your eyes welled up and you weren't sure why, that's the beginning of justice. Not the kind handed down in courtrooms, but the kind that begins in the heart. We can't fix every wrong. We can't bring back those who are gone. We can't erase the pain of the past. But we can choose. We can choose to listen. We can choose to look closer, walk slower, ask more, stay silent less. We can choose to use memory to fight instead of using forgetfulness to survive. Because sometimes a story is not just meant to be told, it's meant to awaken. And if it awakened something in you, don't let it fall back asleep. Tell it. Share it. Listen to those who've never been heard. And speak. Especially when the world around you chooses silence. Because justice sometimes begins with just one person who dares to speak. And today, that person could be you. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. If something in this story made you pause, feel, or reflect, remember, truth isn't just meant to be known. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to be held for those who no longer have a voice. Share this story. Leave us your thoughts. And if you believe in the power of small, quiet truths, subscribe to Stories Around Us, and together, we'll keep bringing light to what the world tries to forget. Because sometimes, one voice at the right moment can awaken an entire world.